Star Fox Adventures is like, it's weird. It's an action adventure game that's more in line with Zelda than it is a Star Fox game, right? And if you don't know, this game was developed by Rare, so people who made Banjo-Kazooie and things like that. And they're not usually the ones to make Star Fox games. This is their one experience, and it is one of the most weirdest games I've played in recent years. One of those reasons, if you have been tuned into the video game industry long enough, you'll know, is this game was not a Star Fox game in the first place. It was a game called Dinosaur Planet. And I think there is something to be said about how that puts this game in like a weird space in terms of like what Star Fox is. But I think it's also weird in the way that this game feels kind of caught between Rare's game design during like the Nintendo 64 era with like all the goofiness and things like that. But it also has like this really genuine attempt to do world building. And so it really tries to craft this world that feels like it wants you to take it seriously. But then there's like an Irish stone guy who shows up and he's like, oh, you want to go to the warp zone? Something like that, right? And so it's this really weird contrast where like it feels like a Banjo-Kazooie game in terms of tone. But when you think about like what it's trying to do from a world building perspective, it feels much more, I don't know how to put it. It's like very otherworldly in very strange ways. It's a very, very bizarre game. So, when you think of Star Fox games overall, the gameplay experience you usually have is, largely space flight stuff. Occasionally you'll get some games with some on-ground sequences and things like that, or some kind of like tank sequence or something like that. This game doesn't really have that. Flying is a part of this game, but it's really just kind of like tacked on as like a mini game. This game's actually kind of packed with a ton of mini games, and it kind of qualifies in that space. It's not very well made, in my opinion. It doesn't feel as good as like Star Fox 64, but it's not the focus of the game. So I think that's fairly reasonable. Every single flying mini game is basically just fly through however many gold rings, and there's like a score counter. It just feels very un-Star Fox in how it's presented in a lot of ways, but it kind of has the shell of a Star Fox game on top of it. So the core game itself is really focused on exploration and puzzle solving. It's a very open game in a strange way as well. So it doesn't really hold your hand all that much, but despite, it being fairly open, it also has a lot of very clear, narrow paths. So what you have is a lot of areas in the game that kind of have a central area that you're exploring, and then little tunnel systems that kind of come off of it. And the tunnel systems can literally be tunnel systems in some cases, but other times it's just like very narrow corridors. And it seems very, like, if you know how video game design works, it definitely feels like, oh, we're hiding some loading zones here. But, I think, knowing that much is not really that important. There's just a lot of spaces in this game that you kind of tread over a lot, and it just feels very unnatural in its design and stuff like that. And again, it kind of goes at a contrast to this game that's like trying to build a world in a lot of ways. But because it has that more open design, what the key aspect is to navigating this world is basically finding various items and skills that basically act as keys to lock doors, right? So there's like this little jet pad you can kind of launch up using. There's like these little levers you can kind of hit. You have different like elemental shots and things like that, and each of these kind of solve different problems in the worlds themselves, and some of them are a little bit more natural. I'd say most of them actually feel very unnatural. The puzzle system in this game like takes a very Zelda approach where it's like, oh, you want to hit the switch on the wall, but you're like in the middle of like a like snow forest or whatever, and then just like this very mechanical switch is just like sticking out of a tree for like no reason. You hit it, and then like this rock kind of just like comes out of the water in a really strange and bizarre way that it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So there's a lot of things about this world that just doesn't feel very real. It feels very, very video gamey in a lot of ways. And this is also true, I think, in how the dialogue plays out and how things are communicated to the player, because I think they have a hard time finding ways to really direct you where you need to go. So very rarely does it feel natural in terms of like what your next objective is. It often feels like you're asking characters in the game to kind of figure it out, and they have to tell it to you in a very video gamey kind of way. Slippy is kind of your main hint system, and he'll sit there and kind of walk through what you should be doing next. And sometimes that is often very clear, so you don't need to worry about it that often. But there are definitely moments in the game where, like, for example, there's like these weeds you have to kind of get off a tree, and you need to kind of put them out. And if you use a variety of different attacks on them, it just destroys these weeds. But if you hit them with your rod, it puts out, they're called fireweeds, so they're all on fire. If you hit them with your rod, it puts the fire out. But you would think like using the ice spell would put the fire out, but no, it just blows up the weed. So it's like strange things like that, just like weird, illogical design that doesn't really, I think, fit naturally with like what the player is trying to do in a lot of ways. And I think the reason why it stands out so much in this particular game is Star Fox Adventures has a very like spiritual feel to it. If you're familiar with Crystal, right? Crystal is this very like mystical character in a lot of ways, right? She rides a flying dinosaur. She has like a staff of magic power that Fox uses to fight in this game. He doesn't have his blast or anything like that. And the whole thing is like, oh, Fox, you'd shoot too many people, which is a really weird way to put that, but sure. But yeah, he gets a staff to go beat up a bunch of dinosaurs instead. But there's like this whole system that's about like finding these spirits, and then they talk to you in very, very kind of mystical ways. They're very serious in their implementation, and so it's this thing where you feel like they're trying to build this lore out and like really in ways that they really want you to take it seriously, and just the fact it clashes so much just makes it really odd and makes it very inconsistent feeling. But at the same time, I think that is also part of what makes this game stand out, is that harsh contrast between these kind of design philosophies of a Rare platformer kind of thing and you know, something that takes itself a bit more serious in a more Zelda style way, right? Well, I am curious if like Cameo or something like that from Rare kind of fulfills this vision in the end. I never actually played Cameo on the Xbox 360. I'd be kind of curious if it takes it a bit more seriously, or if Rare kind of views the more like goofy elements of its dialogue and characters as like a essential part of its DNA. And I think that contrast is like really part of what makes it stand out, though. Like it's a hodgepodge of Rare kind of collectathon platformer design where you're kind of going around these environments, collecting items that open up new doors. But then it also has like the Zelda element to it, where you're kind of going to these temples and dungeons and solving puzzles and things like that. And, you know, I feel like there are a lot of games during the GameCube era that kind of honestly took this approach. But I wonder, you know, I haven't played a lot of them. And I feel like with this game, there's probably something unique about its feeling of mashing up that kind of Rare world and tone with the Zelda world and game design, right? It's very interesting in that regard. I say this as somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience with Rare, so maybe I'm misconstruing exactly like what was the inspiration here, but it definitely feels like this strange mishmash of two design philosophies that were kind of under the same roof with Nintendo, right? So, but it's really, I think, interesting in that regard at the very least.